under the dim, golden glow of an antique desk lamp. The stillness of Clarence's house felt almost unnatural. The night was deep, the city outside muffled by thick curtains that had hung in place for decades. King Charles sat alone, his posture slightly hunched, not from age but from the weight of thoughts he couldn't quite name. His hands rested on the polished wood before him, but his eyes were fixed on a small, ornate jewelry box. It was not new. The filigree edges bore tiny marks of wear, and the lock mechanism had a faint scratch running across its brass surface, a sign it had been opened and closed more times than one might expect for something that should hold only ceremonial keepsakes. He had not meant to open it. In truth, he had been looking for something else entirely, a family heirloom he wanted to show William in preparation for a private conversation about the monarchy's future. But in shifting aside silk scarves and a framed photograph of Camilla from years past, his hand had landed on the box. For a reason he couldn't immediately explain, he felt compelled to open it. It was as though the room itself leaned in, urging him forward. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The small click of the clasp seemed deafening in the quiet. When the lid lifted, the scent of lavender oil and faint traces of perfume drifted out. Inside was a small arrangement of items, a brooch from a foreign visit, a pair of pearl earrings he recognized instantly, a locket he knew she had worn since her youth. And then, nestled in the center, on a bed of dark velvet, was a wedding ring. His breath caught, his chest tightening with a sharp and sudden ache. But this wasn't the ring he had placed on her finger on that April day in 2005. Charles knew every detail of that ring. He had chosen it himself with care, selecting a design that merged tradition with personal meaning, a band of Welsh gold, polished but understated, carrying with it a history that stretched back generations in the royal family. This ring, however, was different. The gold was warmer in tone, almost reddish under the light, and the setting held a small but noticeable diamond flanked by two sapphires. It was elegant, yes, but not royal in design. It was not his. He reached out, fingers trembling slightly, and lifted it from the velvet. The weight was different. Not heavier, not lighter, just different. He turned it over in his palm, his mind racing through every possible explanation. Could it be an old family heirloom of hers? Something sentimental from her past? But even if it were, why keep it here, hidden in a box alongside items tied so closely to their shared life? And why in the space where her royal wedding ring should have been? For several minutes, he sat unmoving, staring at the object as though it might, by sheer will, give up its secret. His mind began to drift backward, past the wedding day, past the years of public appearances and joint engagements, back to the private moments before they were married. There had been whispers, even then, about the complexity of Camilla's romantic history. He had heard the names, felt the cold shadow of speculation. But they had agreed, privately, to leave the past in the past. He had trusted her in this. The sound of a clock ticking on the mantel filled the room, every second loud and deliberate, marking the growing space between the man he was when he sat down and the man he was becoming in this moment. He set the ring down again, as carefully as one might handle an artifact. The thought pressed on him relentlessly. If this was not his ring, then whose was it? And why, after all these years, was it here? The middle of the night has a way of turning thoughts into storms. As the minutes passed, Charles felt the pull between reason and emotion intensify. Reason told him there could be many explanations. Emotion reminded him that betrayal often hides in the folds of the ordinary. He had given her his trust in the form of that original ring, and now he was staring at a replacement he never sanctioned. In the days leading up to this night, there had been no obvious signs. Camilla had been her usual self, publicly poised, privately direct, and occasionally sharp in her humor. They had attended functions together, exchanged quiet glances at speeches, and smiled in photographs that would circle the world within hours. If there was a fracture forming, he had not seen it. Yet here, in this box, was evidence of something unsaid. A token, a relic, or perhaps a promise made to someone else long before their vows. The air in the study grew heavier. Charles felt as though the walls themselves, adorned with portraits of ancestors, were silently watching, weighing his reaction. He knew that in the royal family, personal matters rarely remained personal for long. If he confronted her and she deflected, where would that leave them? If he ignored it, could he live with the gnawing knowledge that something might be wrong? He picked up the ring once more and studied it closely, noting the fine engraving inside the band. The inscription was so delicate that it took him a moment to decipher it under the lamplight. Just a date. No names. The numbers were not familiar, certainly not their wedding date. His chest tightened again. The more he looked, the more this small, gleaming circle of gold began to feel like a wedge driven between them. The thought of their wedding replayed in his mind. He could see her standing there, a mix of confidence and vulnerability, the eyes of the world upon them. He could hear the murmured applause, the solemn vows, the weight of centuries pressing on his shoulders. In that moment, the ring he gave her had symbolized unity. Now, faced with this other ring, he felt an unspoken dissonance. It was like finding a letter in a drawer written to someone else, and signed but deeply personal. He placed the ring back in the box and closed the lid, but the sound of the clasp shutting did nothing to quiet the unrest in his mind. It was not just the object that disturbed him, it was the implication. If this was from another man, then that man had, in some way, remained present in her life all this time. And if it wasn't, why had she never told him about it? Charles leaned back in his chair, his hand covering his mouth as if to hold in words he wasn't ready to say. The question forming in his mind was not one he could easily ask, not without changing the nature of their relationship forever. He could feel the delicate balance of trust and doubt shifting inside him, the scale tipping with every beat of the clock. He knew there would be a moment, soon, when he'd have to decide whether to bring it up directly or to investigate quietly. Both paths carried risk. One could ignite a firestorm of emotion behind closed doors. The other could set him on a solitary journey into truths he might regret uncovering. The choice was his, but the consequences would be shared. Outside, the city slept on, unaware that in one of its grandest residences, the king was wrestling with questions that could shake the very foundations of his marriage. In that quiet, he realized something with unsettling clarity. A single object, no larger than the tip of his thumb, had the power to unravel years of history, trust, and carefully crafted public image. The night would pass, the sun would rise, and the day's duties would begin, but nothing would feel the same again. He remained there until the first pale light of dawn touched the edges of the curtain. Only then did he stand, the jewelry box still in his hand, and move toward the safe where he kept documents and valuables. For now, he would place it there, away from prying eyes. But the question would follow him into the day, into the week, into the very fabric of his life. Whose ring was it? And why had she kept it? The moment of discovery had been a lightning strike, but the hours that followed were the slow burn of something far more dangerous. It was the kind of night that didn't just end when the sun rose. It clung to him, carried forward like a shadow he couldn't shake. Even as the palace began to stir with the familiar sounds of morning, the soft clinking of china from the kitchens, the hushed conversations of staff in the corridors, Charles felt as though he was moving through a world that had shifted ever so slightly out of place. He replayed the moment over and over, the way the ring had caught the lamplight, the unnatural familiarity of it sitting in that box where something else should have been. He could still feel the cool weight of it in his palm, the texture of the engraving that had startled him into a deeper unease. He had not confronted Camilla immediately. Instinct told him that the truth, whatever it was, would not be something offered freely. When he stepped out of his private study that morning, the palace corridors were a mixture of routine and subtle hierarchy. Footmen passed him with respectful bows, aides approached with the day's schedules, and a small stack of correspondence waited in the outer room. On any other day, his mind would have been occupied with speeches, meetings, and the inevitable tangle of royal obligations. But not today. Today, his thoughts were locked in a private chamber, circling around the object he had found. Breakfast was served in the smaller dining room, as it often was when the day ahead promised a long schedule. Camilla was already there, her posture relaxed, a newspaper folded neatly beside her plate. She glanced up with her usual morning greeting, her voice calm, almost cheerful. If she noticed anything unusual in his manner, she didn't show it. He studied her in a way he hadn't in years. Every small movement, every flicker of expression felt like a potential clue. She buttered a slice of toast, sipped her tea, and made an offhand remark about a headline. To anyone else, it would have seemed perfectly normal, the easy rhythm of a long-married couple. But for Charles, every word she spoke was now measured against the unspoken question in his mind. As the meal went on, he found himself glancing at her left hand. The ring he had given her was there, gleaming faintly in the morning light. But now, knowing there was another ring hidden away, it felt different. It was as though the one she wore in public was a costume piece, an emblem for the world to see, while the real story, the secret story, sat in that box. After breakfast, they parted for their separate engagements. She was to attend a charity function. He had a series of meetings. Yet even as he sat in a room discussing policy and ceremonial duties, his mind kept slipping back to the jewelry box. In moments when others spoke, he would hear the echo of that faint metallic click, the moment the lid opened, the sight of gold that wasn't his. By midday, he knew he couldn't just let it sit there unanswered. But confronting her head-on was dangerous. A direct accusation without proof could rupture things beyond repair, and their public image, already delicate, could not withstand open hostility. There was a way to approach it, but it required patience. That evening, after the day's events, Charles returned to the study. He unlocked the safe and brought the box back to the desk. This time, he examined the ring more thoroughly, using a magnifying glass. The craftsmanship was fine, but not of the style favored by the royal jewelers. The engraving inside, that lone date, was still there, clear now under the stronger light. It was a date from long before their marriage. He began to think back to the years before they were wed, the times when their paths had crossed in public and in private, and the relationships she had before him. One name rose in his memory, a man whose presence in her life had been more than passing. It was the kind of connection that had once been whispered about, tucked away in gossip columns, and politely ignored in official circles. The thought unsettled him, not just because of what it might mean, but because it made the ring feel heavier, more intimate. If that man had given it to her, then she had kept a physical reminder of him all these years, close enough to reach for whenever she wanted. It was an emotional tether to a past he thought had been severed, but suspicion alone was not enough. He needed to know, and so, he made a quiet decision. He would not confront her immediately. Instead, he would turn to someone he trusted, someone capable of finding answers discreetly. The palace had its share of loyal aides, but this was too delicate to entrust to anyone bound by official protocol. He thought of one in particular, a man who had served him for years, whose discretion was beyond question. That night, after Camilla had retired, Charles called the aide into the study. He spoke plainly but carefully, describing the ring, its location, and the inscription. He did not voice his suspicions outright, but the implication was clear. The aide listened without interruption, his expression calm, and when Charles finished, he simply nodded once. There would be inquiries, quiet ones, starting immediately. The following days were a study in controlled tension. Publicly, Charles and Camilla continued their duties side by side. They attended events, shook hands, smiled for cameras, all while the private weight of the discovery pressed down between them. Charles became adept at hiding his thoughts in plain sight, masking the undercurrent of suspicion with the smooth polish of royal protocol. But at night, when the palace quieted and the halls grew still, he would find himself drawn back to the box. Sometimes he opened it. Sometimes he simply stared at it, the lid closed, as though the object inside could hear his thoughts. He began to realize that the ring was more than just a piece of jewelry. It was a symbol of a question he wasn't sure he wanted answered, a question that, once asked, could not be taken back. Even as the aide began to return with small pieces of information, a jeweler's mark traced to a private craftsman, a record of a similar ring appearing in an auction decades earlier, Charles felt himself torn. Each clue drew him closer to the truth, but also closer to a line that, once crossed, would change everything. It was in this quiet, heavy uncertainty that the moment of discovery truly began to sink in. It was not a single event, but the start of a chain reaction that would touch every part of their life together. And as Charles began to sense, this was only the beginning. The memory of their wedding day was not something Charles had to strain to recall. It was etched into him in a way that no amount of time could blur. The cool air of that April morning, the slight scent of blossoms drifting through the open doors of the chapel, the low hum of anticipation from the guests. It all returned to him with a clarity that made his chest tighten. He had been through the ceremony in his mind countless times over the years, but now, with the discovery of that unfamiliar ring, those memories took on a different shade. He remembered standing at the altar, waiting for her to arrive. The moment she stepped into view, there had been a quiet ripple through the congregation, a subtle shift in the air as every eye turned to her. She had walked toward him with a measured grace, her gaze steady, her smile faint but genuine. He had seen in her expression a mixture of resolve and vulnerability, the same mixture that had always been part of their complicated bond. The ring he had chosen for her had been a decision made with both tradition and personal meaning in mind. Welsh gold, a material that had been used for royal wedding rings since the 1920s, was non-negotiable. He had worked with the jeweler to design something simple yet dignified, a band that would not overshadow the vows but would instead serve as a quiet, enduring symbol of them. There had been no gemstones, no elaborate design, just a pure, warm band of gold polished to a soft gleam. He could still recall the exact moment he placed it on her finger, the way her hand felt in his, the coolness of the metal against his skin. The exchange had been brief, but in that instant, it was as if they had sealed not just a legal union, but a promise to stand against everything they had endured, the scrutiny, the criticism, the years of public and private complexity. That ring had not just been a piece of jewelry. It was a statement that they had reached this moment together, and that they would go forward as one. Now, as he thought back to that day, the image of the original ring seemed to blur with the sight of the one he had found in her jewelry box. They were not just different in appearance, they were different in meaning. The one he had given her was a testament to their shared journey, forged in the fire of years spent navigating a world that had not always welcomed them. The other was something entirely separate. Something that carried a history he did not know and had not been invited to share in. Charles found himself wondering if she had ever worn that other ring during their marriage, even briefly, when no one else was around. The thought was unsettling, almost disorienting. He had never doubted the symbolic permanence of their wedding bands. They were meant to be worn as a daily reaffirmation of their commitment. If she had kept another ring all this time, what did that say about her own understanding of their bond? The more he dwelled on it, the more he felt the ache of a question he could not yet ask. Their marriage had always existed in two spheres, the public one, full of carefully managed appearances and protocols, and the private one, where moments of genuine connection were mixed with the echoes of past choices. That second sphere was far more fragile, and he knew that bringing this matter into it could cause fractures that might never heal. Still, the memories kept coming. The reception after their wedding had been a quieter affair than most royal celebrations, a deliberate choice to keep the focus on the meaning of the day rather than the spectacle. He had watched her laugh with guests, her hand never far from the one that now bore his ring. At the time, it had filled him with a deep sense of relief, as though all the doubts and obstacles that had once seemed insurmountable had finally been put to rest. But now, looking back through the lens of what he had found, he felt a subtle shift in those memories. Were there moments, even then, when she had been thinking of someone else? Was the past as settled as he had believed, or had she been carrying pieces of it forward into their present? He could not know, and the absence of an answer was as heavy as the truth might have been. Charles thought of the photographs from that day. The ones displayed in public, the ones kept in private albums, the ones sent to family and friends. In every image, the ring on her finger was the one he had chosen, unmistakable in its simplicity. Those images had become part of the official record, a permanent statement of unity. And yet, hidden away in a small box, there was another ring entirely, quietly challenging the reality those photographs represented. He began to realize that this was why the discovery unsettled him so deeply. It was not just that she had kept another man's ring, if indeed that was what it was, but that it introduced doubt into something he had believed to be absolute. The wedding ring was supposed to be a singular symbol, one that could not be replaced or altered without changing the meaning of the marriage itself. To find that there was another, kept close and in secret, felt like a rewriting of their history. As the day wore on, Charles found himself returning to the memory of slipping that band onto her finger, hearing the words of the vows they had spoken. He thought of how he had believed, in that moment, that everything they had gone through had led them to a place where they could finally stand side by side without the ghosts of the past intruding. Now, the possibility that one of those ghosts had been kept alive, polished, and preserved in the form of a ring, made that belief feel fragile. He did not yet know what he would do with this knowledge. He only knew that the memory of their wedding, once a source of reassurance, had been altered. The past was no longer a fixed thing, it was shifting under his feet. And as he moved through the palace that evening, exchanging polite words with staff and offering nods to visitors, he carried with him the quiet, unshakable truth that the ring he had found had changed the way he saw everything that came after. This was not just about an object. It was about the meaning they had built together, the story they had told the world, and the reality that might be waiting underneath. And somewhere in the spaces between memory and fact, he sensed that this was only the beginning of the reckoning that lay ahead. Charles had always possessed a meticulous eye for detail, the sort of awareness that came not only from his upbringing, but from decades of navigating the subtle codes of the royal world. That instinct was now fully engaged as he sat at his desk once more, the unfamiliar wedding ring before him on a piece of soft cloth. The urge to understand its origin was no longer a passing curiosity, it was a quiet compulsion. The room was silent except for the muted hum of the radiator, yet the air felt charged, as though something unseen was pressing him toward an answer. The first thing he noticed was the color. It wasn't the soft, muted tone of Welsh gold, which he knew so well from the ring he had given Camilla. This gold was richer, with a faint reddish hue that spoke of a different alloy. He turned it slowly between his fingers, watching the way the light caught along the edges. This wasn't the work of Gerard or Asprey, the traditional royal jewelers whose style he could identify in an instant. No, this had the hand of a craftsman who worked privately, perhaps even outside Britain. His gaze moved to the stones, a small central diamond flanked by two sapphires, their blue deep and unclouded. The diamond wasn't the largest, but it had a particular brilliance, as if cut with precision for someone who valued refinement over ostentation. The sapphires were unusual in placement, tilted ever so slightly inward, giving the setting a feeling of intimacy rather than public display. It was a design that spoke to personal meaning, not ceremonial tradition. He tilted the ring to study the underside of the band. That was when he saw it again, the inscription. A date, delicately engraved in a script so fine it was almost invisible without deliberate scrutiny. He murmured it under his breath. It was not a date that corresponded to any event in his life with Camilla. In fact, as he thought about it, it might have been from a period when they were apart, living their lives in different worlds. The discovery tightened something in his chest. Rings like this weren't bought on a whim. They were chosen with intention, often to mark a significant moment, a proposal, an anniversary, or a private promise between two people. If the date belonged to someone else's timeline with her, it meant the ring was not only from another man, but carried an unspoken chapter of her life that she had never invited him into. Charles set the ring down and opened a leather-bound notebook from his desk drawer. He began jotting small notes, observations about the craftsmanship, the style, the materials, anything that might help trace its origin. He was methodical, but also aware that the more he studied it, the more personal the investigation became. This wasn't simply about identifying a piece of jewelry. It was about determining whether a part of Camilla's life had been preserved in secrecy for decades. His mind drifted to the possibility that the ring could have been from her early years, perhaps a relationship that had never reached the public's attention. Yet the design felt too deliberate, too sentimental, to have been casual. The thought of her keeping such an object, and in the very box where her royal wedding ring should have been, stirred something deeper than suspicion. It was almost as if the ring had been placed there intentionally, a quiet defiance, a way of holding on to a private truth beneath the surface of their shared life. He reached for a magnifying glass and inspected the metal again. There, faint but clear, was a tiny maker's mark near the base of the band. It was nothing he recognized immediately, which only deepened the mystery. Maker's marks could be traced to a city, to a workshop, sometimes even to a specific jeweler. But doing so discreetly would be a challenge. If word reached the wrong ears, speculation would run rampant, and the tabloids would turn the story into a public storm before he had a chance to confirm the truth. That night, unable to let the matter rest, he summoned the aide he trusted most. The man had served in the household for over 20 years, the kind of figure who could slip in and out of places without drawing attention. When Charles showed him the ring, the aide did not ask unnecessary questions. He examined it carefully, noting the maker's mark and the unusual blend of gold, and said in a low voice that he could make discreet inquiries. It might take time, but he would find the jeweler or at least narrow the search. After the aide left, Charles remained alone with the ring. He thought about the journey it might have taken, from the hands of the man who commissioned it, to Camilla's possession, to its quiet resting place in the jewelry box. How many times had she opened that box and seen it? How often had her fingers traced the engraving when no one was watching? The thought unsettled him in a way he could not shake. Over the following days, the palace continued its normal rhythms, but Charles felt them only distantly. At events, his public smile never faltered, but in quieter moments his mind returned to the same image, the ring, its hidden date, and the unspoken question it carried. He began to notice small things. A flicker in Camilla's expression when certain topics arose, a subtle shift in her posture when she caught him watching her. None of it was enough to prove anything, but it added to the feeling that they were both moving through a silent game neither wanted to name. When the aide returned with the first hint of information, Charles felt the weight of the moment before a word was spoken. The jeweler's mark, it seemed, belonged to a small workshop in the south of France, known for custom commissions made quietly for private clients. They rarely advertised, surviving entirely on reputation and discretion. The workshop had been active during the period of the engraved date. The implication was clear. Someone had gone to lengths to ensure this ring was unique, intimate, and untraceable by casual inquiry. That night, Charles sat in his study long after the rest of the household had retired. The ring lay in front of him, the lamplight glinting off its stones. The truth was no closer, yet the mystery had deepened. The more he learned about the ring, the more it became a symbol of everything unsaid between them. He could feel the tension building, not just in himself, but in the unspoken spaces between them. He knew that at some point, he would have to choose. Would he confront her directly and risk the upheaval it might cause? Or would he continue the quiet search for the truth, walking the narrow line between curiosity and distrust? The answer would shape more than just their marriage. It would shape how he lived with himself in the years to come. It began subtly, so subtly that anyone outside their world would not have noticed. To the public, Charles and Camilla appeared exactly as they always had, walking side by side at official engagements, exchanging quiet words at ceremonial events, smiling for photographs with dignitaries. But for those who knew them well, for those who understood how every gesture between them carried meaning, the difference was undeniable. Charles had always been measured in public, his expressions controlled, his tone even. But now there was a faint hesitation in his interactions with her, as though each moment of shared presence required a conscious choice. He still offered his hand when stepping out of a carriage, but his grip was lighter, less instinctive. He still leaned in to speak during crowded receptions, but his eyes did not always meet hers. It was as if something invisible had taken up residence between them, altering the rhythm of their movements. The first time it was truly noticeable was during a formal dinner at Buckingham Palace. It was an evening meant to honor a visiting head of state, with all the ceremony such an occasion demanded. They entered the grand dining hall together, as protocol dictated, but when they reached their seats, there was a small pause. Camilla glanced at him, waiting for some quiet word or smile, and he simply nodded before turning to greet the guest at his side. It was nothing overt, nothing the cameras could seize upon, yet it carried the weight of withheld warmth. Throughout the evening, Charles found himself drifting in and out of the conversation at the table. His mind kept returning to the ring, to the date engraved inside, to the jeweler's workshop in France. Each time Camilla spoke, he listened, but part of him was measuring her tone, searching for something in her words that might explain what he had found. She laughed at a remark from one of the guests, her hand resting lightly on the table, the familiar royal wedding band catching the candlelight. He wondered if, somewhere out of sight, the other ring still lay where he had found it, or if she had moved it. In the days that followed, the sense of quiet watchfulness grew. At a charity event, Charles noticed her speaking with an acquaintance whose name stirred an uneasy recognition. He remembered seeing it in some old correspondence years ago, though he could not place where. When their eyes met across the room, Camilla's expression was as composed as ever, but he thought he saw a flicker, quick, almost imperceptible, before she looked away. The press, of course, continued to publish photographs of them together, smiling and poised. To the outside world, nothing had changed. But Charles knew the palace staff had begun to notice. His valet, who had served him for decades, seemed to linger a little longer when bringing in the evening mail, perhaps sensing the unspoken tension. Even the senior aides, trained to overlook personal matters, exchanged brief glances when Charles and Camilla passed each other in the corridors with little more than polite words. It was at a garden party in the palace grounds where the change became harder to disguise. The day was warm, the guests a mix of charity representatives, civic leaders, and military personnel. As they moved from group to group, Camilla's usual ease seemed slightly forced. Charles, too, felt the strain. In the past, he would have shared small asides with her, light remarks to keep the pace of such events pleasant. Now, those moments were fewer. There was no argument, no public display of discord, only the absence of a connection that had once been easy. Later that evening, after the guests had gone and the grounds were quiet, Charles returned to his study. The ring was still there, in the box inside the safe, untouched since he had last examined it. But its presence was like a living thing in the room, occupying space not just in the safe, but in his thoughts, shaping how he moved through each day. He realized that this was the effect of unspoken suspicion. It seeped into everything, altering even the smallest interactions. That night, as they prepared for bed, Camilla spoke about an upcoming event. Her voice was casual, but Charles sensed the way she was watching him, perhaps looking for a sign, perhaps wondering if he had something on his mind. He offered only a few words in response. The conversation ended quickly, not with tension but with an unfinished quality, as though both were aware of something unsaid. Over the next week, public engagements became a kind of quiet theater. They played their roles well enough that no headline hinted at trouble. But beneath the surface, the distance was growing. Charles began to notice how often her hand would stray to her left ring finger, almost unconsciously touching the band he had given her. He couldn't tell if it was habit, reassurance, or something else entirely. It was during a state visit to a Commonwealth nation that the tension reached a point he could no longer ignore. Standing on the tarmac beside her as they greeted local officials, he caught a glimpse of her jewelry, earrings, a necklace, and felt a sudden, irrational rush of suspicion. None of it was new, yet the thought lodged in his mind that she could be carrying something else, something unseen, just as she had kept that other ring. By the time they returned to London, Charles knew that their public composure could not last forever. The unanswered questions were no longer just in his mind. They were beginning to shape the way they moved through the world together. And if he had learned anything in his life, it was that the smallest fracture, left unattended, could one day bring down even the most carefully constructed facade. It started as nothing more than a subtle shift in the air inside the palace, the kind of thing that only those who had been there for years could detect. The footmen and housekeepers, the aides and private secretaries, they all moved through their duties as usual, but they noticed the change. They noticed the way the king's tone had lost its warmth when addressing the queen consort, the way Camilla sometimes left a room just a little sooner than she might have before, as though avoiding lingering too long in his company. Palace life thrives on routine, and any disruption, no matter how small, becomes part of the whispered undercurrent that flows through its halls. Within a week, the whispers had begun. A junior aide, delivering documents late in the evening, mentioned quietly to a colleague that he had seen the king alone in his study long after midnight, the light still burning, his posture heavy. A maid, tasked with tidying the queen's private sitting room, thought she noticed a change in the arrangement of her personal jewelry, as if something had been moved. No one said outright what they suspected. In the royal household, direct speculation about the personal lives of the monarch and his consort was dangerous. But there was a way these things traveled, through half-finished sentences, raised eyebrows, and the smallest pauses in conversation. Those who had served during the most turbulent years of the family's past knew the signs. One of Charles's longest-serving aides had begun to feel the shift most keenly. He was the one the king had entrusted with the investigation into the mysterious ring, and while he would never betray that confidence, he could sense how the knowledge hung between them like a sealed envelope no one dared open. He went about his task discreetly, sending inquiries to trusted contacts, framing them in such a way that they would not draw unwanted attention. Yet each lead he found, each name he traced, seemed to pull the matter further into dangerous territory. Camilla, for her part, appeared outwardly unaffected. She kept her schedule, attended her events, and even engaged warmly with the staff in ways that might have been meant to suggest nothing was amiss. But for those attuned to her moods, there was a faint edge to her interactions. At times, she seemed unusually careful with her words when speaking to Charles in public, as though aware that even the smallest misstep could be magnified under the weight of his watchfulness. The gossip remained unspoken in the press, but inside the palace walls, it was impossible to ignore. One afternoon, during a planning meeting for a state banquet, a senior courtier noticed the king was unusually curt when discussing Camilla's seating arrangements. It was a minor matter, something that would normally have been handled with casual agreement. Instead, Charles questioned the placement, requested changes, and then abruptly moved on to another subject, leaving the room in a silence that no one dared break. That evening, in the stillness of the private wing, a hushed conversation took place between two longtime members of the household. They spoke cautiously, in the coded language that palace staff used when discussing matters they couldn't fully name. One asked whether this felt like the early days of that other situation, referring to a past royal scandal that had begun with the same kind of subtle withdrawal. The other only nodded. The sense of unease grew stronger when a trusted member of Camilla's personal staff quietly inquired with a colleague if the king had seemed preoccupied lately. That word, preoccupied, carried weight. It meant he was thinking about something that overshadowed the business of the day, something he would not easily set aside. It was during this period that the aide investigating the ring returned with a new detail, an old invoice from the French workshop, dated with the same year as the inscription. The name on the invoice was not Camilla's. It was a man's name, unfamiliar to the aide but significant enough to warrant caution. The workshop had made no record of the ring being collected by anyone other than the person who commissioned it. That alone suggested a deliberate transaction, and the aide delivered this information to Charles in the privacy of his study. The king took it without visible reaction, though the silence that followed was longer than usual. When he finally spoke, it was only to say that the matter should be pursued further, but with even greater care. He did not want a single word of it escaping beyond the walls of the palace. By now, the whispers among the staff had taken on a shape of their own. They didn't know about the ring, but they sensed something was hidden, something private, guarded, and potentially explosive. In a place where history had shown that the smallest secret could one day become a headline, that awareness settled heavily over the household. Camilla seemed to notice it too. At dinners, she would scan the room in a way that suggested she was measuring who might be watching too closely. At one reception, she leaned toward Charles with what looked like a casual remark, but he responded with only a brief nod, his gaze fixed on the middle distance. That moment, caught in the periphery of several observers, became another unspoken addition to the quiet archive of signs. By the end of the month, the sense of restraint between them had grown into something almost palpable. Those who moved in and out of their private spaces did so with greater care, aware that a wrong word or look could place them in the center of something they were not meant to see. And though nothing had been confirmed, the truth was already alive within the palace. There was a fracture forming, and it was only a matter of time before it either closed in silence or split open for all to see. Charles had spent much of his life managing the balance between what he wanted to know and what he was better off leaving unexamined. In the monarchy, some truths could be dangerous not only to the person who discovered them, but to the institution itself. Yet as the days passed, the unanswered questions about the ring became a weight he could no longer carry passively. The date engraved inside, the unfamiliar name on the jeweler's invoice, and the knowledge that Camilla had kept it all these years pressed against his thoughts like a tide that would not recede. The decision to look deeper came late one night, alone in his study. The palace was asleep, the corridors silent except for the occasional creak of settling wood. He had the ring in front of him again, its stones glinting faintly under the desk lamp. The light caught the engraving in a way that made it look almost fresh, as if whoever had given it to her had intended its meaning to endure. He thought of the man's name on the invoice, the fact that it was dated years before their marriage, and something in him hardened. He summoned the aide who had been assisting him and gave instructions in a voice so low it was almost a whisper. He wanted every discreet lead followed, every record examined, every private channel explored. He was aware of the risks. If anyone beyond their tight circle became aware of the inquiry, the questions it would raise could be catastrophic. But he told himself the truth mattered more. If there was nothing to find, then he could put the matter to rest. If there was something, he needed to know before it found its way to someone else. The aide's first step was to trace the man named on the invoice. The initial findings came quickly. He had once been a well-connected businessman in the south of France, known for his presence at exclusive gatherings and for his connections to aristocratic circles. The timeline placed him in London several times during the years before Charles and Camilla's marriage, dates that coincided with events she had attended. The aide presented these findings with caution, his tone carefully neutral. Charles listened without interruption, though his mind was already moving through the possibilities. Had Camilla known him personally? Was the ring a gift from a fleeting acquaintance? Or was it something more? The lack of definitive answers made it worse. Every scrap of information was enough to build suspicion, but not enough to draw a conclusion. Unable to quiet his thoughts, Charles began consulting sources outside the official royal network, individuals he had known for decades, people who understood the necessity of discretion. He reached out to an old friend, a retired diplomat who had spent years in postings across Europe. The man agreed to make inquiries of his own, using contacts who would not immediately connect their interest back to the king. As the investigation expanded, Charles found himself behaving differently around Camilla, not out of calculated strategy, but because the search for answers had created a barrier he could not cross. At meals, he spoke less. In public, he still offered the outward signs of unity, but in private, he was guarded. He studied her reactions to seemingly unrelated topics, wondering if a certain name, place, or date would spark something. A glance, a pause, a tightening of her tone. One evening, they attended a reception for an arts foundation. The guest list was filled with figures from London's cultural elite, as well as a few foreign guests of note. Halfway through the evening, Charles noticed a man across the room watching Camilla with what struck him as unusual familiarity. She noticed too and excused herself to speak with another group. Charles did not approach the man, but the image of that brief exchange stayed with him. The following day, the aide reported back with another detail. The French businessman whose name was on the invoice had passed away some years ago, but his personal papers, kept by a family member, contained correspondence that included mention of a ring. The language was vague, careful, but it suggested the piece had been made for someone of deep personal significance to him. There was no name in the letter, but the timing aligned with the engraving. Charles sat back in his chair when he heard this, the implications sinking in. If the ring had been commissioned for Camilla, then she had kept it through the years, through their marriage, and through every moment they had shared as a couple. If it had been for someone else, then why was it in her possession now? Either answer felt heavy. That night, he found himself awake long after Camilla had gone to sleep. He walked the halls of the palace in silence, his steps echoing faintly against the polished floors. The portraits of past monarchs lined the walls, their painted eyes following him, each one a reminder of the weight of history and the personal sacrifices it demanded. He wondered how many of them had faced moments like this, moments when the truth, once uncovered, could never be undone. By the time he returned to his study, he had made up his mind. The investigation would continue, no matter how long it took. He needed to know where the ring had come from, why it had been kept, and what it truly meant. But as he placed it back in its box, he felt an unease he could not shake. The path he had chosen might lead him to the truth, but it could also lead to a place from which there would be no return. It was inevitable that the outside world would begin to sense something. The British press was as much a living organism as it was an institution. Its reporters attuned to the smallest shifts in tone, the subtlest deviations from routine. For weeks, Charles had managed to keep his private search contained within the palace walls, confined to only a few trusted individuals. But the very nature of such a secret created ripples. and ripples, when they reached the right ears, became waves. It began with a single column in one of the less reputable tabloids, buried halfway down the page. The piece speculated that the king seemed preoccupied at recent engagements, that his public warmth toward the queen consort appeared muted. It was vague enough to be brushed off as idle gossip, but for Charles, it was a warning shot. Somewhere, somehow, someone outside had noticed the change. He knew the palace press office would handle it in the usual way, by neither confirming nor denying anything, by redirecting attention to official duties and charitable work. But privately, he recognized the danger. If even one journalist decided to dig further, they could stumble upon something he was not yet ready to face himself. The media did not need proof to build a story. They only needed a thread, and he had seen more than once how quickly a thread could unravel an entire tapestry. Camilla, too, seemed aware of the column. At breakfast the next morning, she placed the newspaper on the table with deliberate care, her fingers lingering on the edge of the page. She made no direct comment, but there was an unspoken message in the way she glanced at him before turning the page. Whether it was curiosity, irritation, or warning, he couldn't tell. Meanwhile, the investigation continued. The aide had traced a former employee of the French jeweler, now living quietly in Marseille. Through an intermediary, they secured a meeting, far from London, far from the reach of the press. The aide returned with notes from the conversation. The former employee remembered the ring. More than that, he recalled that it had been commissioned under strict instructions. No duplicates, no public record beyond the invoice, and the work to be completed personally by the head craftsman. It was, he said, for someone very dear to the client. The phrase lingered with Charles. Very dear. It was the sort of language that left no doubt about personal attachment. But it still left him without a definitive link to Camilla. The absence of a name in the jeweler's account was deliberate, and the trail could go no further without stepping into territory that risked exposure. That exposure began to feel closer when, during a charity gala, a journalist from a major paper approached Charles in the reception line. The question was harmless on the surface, whether he and the queen consort were planning any private travel later in the year, but the tone carried a quiet implication. Charles answered politely, offering nothing beyond a vague reference to a busy schedule. But as the journalist moved on, he caught the faintest flicker of a satisfied expression. It was enough to tell him the question had been bait, and he had sidestepped it just in time. In the days that followed, more small hints appeared. A photo in the press captured him standing slightly apart from Camilla at a public engagement, the caption noting their uncharacteristic distance. A columnist speculated, without evidence, that stress from recent events might be affecting the couple. Each mention was still vague, but Charles could feel the noose tightening. The palace press team began quietly monitoring coverage, looking for patterns. They found that a handful of reporters seemed to be watching the couple more closely than usual. Some were veterans of past royal scandals, skilled in reading the spaces between the facts. For now, there was nothing concrete for them to seize on. But Charles understood the danger wasn't in what they knew now. It was in what they might stumble upon if his private search continued much longer. He found himself thinking constantly about containment. The ring was locked away, the investigation's details known only to two people besides himself. But even that felt too exposed. He considered halting the search altogether, yet the thought of never knowing the truth was unbearable. The choice became a trap: pursue the truth and risk discovery, or stop and live with a question that would haunt every moment with her. One evening, as he prepared for yet another public engagement, he caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror. The face staring back at him looked composed, but he could see the tension in the set of his jaw, the faint lines at the corners of his eyes deepened by sleepless nights. He wondered if the press had already begun to capture that change in photographs, interpreting it as they wished. That night, at the event, he and Camilla played their roles flawlessly. They moved together through the crowd, smiling, greeting, laughing at the right moments. But as they left, the flash of cameras lit the evening air. Somewhere among those images, he knew, a keen observer might see the truth, or at least sense it. And once the press sensed something, it was only a matter of time before they started pulling at threads he could no longer control. The clue arrived not through the discreet channels Charles had cultivated, nor from the aide's careful inquiries, but in the most unexpected and unnerving way possible. through something Camilla herself let slip. It was an afternoon without official engagements, one of those rare pockets of time when they could both retreat into their separate corners of the palace. Charles had been in his study, sorting through correspondence, when she appeared at the door holding a small envelope. She mentioned casually that she had found it among a stack of personal letters that had been moved during a recent reorganization of her things. The envelope was unmarked, the flaps still sealed, and she set it on his desk before leaving without explanation. Charles sat for a moment, staring at it. It wasn't unusual for stray letters or notes to surface during a reshuffling of private belongings, but something about her manner, the way she had avoided looking directly at him, made him pause. When he opened it, he found a single folded sheet of fine stationery. The handwriting inside was neat, deliberate, the kind of script that belonged to someone who valued precision. The note was brief, almost cryptic. It read, "For that day, you know what," and beneath it, a date. It was the same date engraved inside the ring. For several minutes, he sat unmoving, the letter held lightly in his hands. The confirmation hit him with quiet force. This was not some vague coincidence. The date had meaning she had never shared with him. And now, here was a physical connection between the ring and an unknown moment in her life. A moment important enough for someone to commemorate with both a letter and a piece of jewelry. The absence of a signature was telling. Whoever had written it had expected her to recognize their hand immediately, without the need for a name. That spoke of intimacy, of a relationship that required no formal identification. It also spoke of secrecy. This was not the sort of message one left lying around carelessly, unless one was certain it would be kept hidden. Charles read the words again, searching for nuance, for some way to interpret them that might lessen the weight of their implication. But there was none. The brevity of the message, combined with its certainty, only deepened the sense that this was not a casual gift, but a deliberate token of personal significance. He folded the letter back into the envelope and placed it in the drawer of his desk, locking it with the small brass key he kept in his pocket. The urge to confront her surged briefly, but he forced it down. If he challenged her now, without knowing the full scope of the truth, she could deny it, deflect it, or offer an explanation crafted to close the matter before he was ready to accept it. Instead, he contacted his aide once more. This time, his instructions were sharper, more urgent. He handed over a careful copy of the letter, never the original, and told the aide to focus on identifying the handwriting. Discretion was paramount. No samples were to be compared within the palace. Everything had to be done through private channels. The aide's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a sign of understanding the increased stakes. He promised to work quickly, but Charles knew that haste carried risk. Still, the presence of the letter changed the equation. He was no longer chasing a shadow. He had something tangible, something that could lead directly to a name. In the days that followed, Charles found himself watching Camilla with a different kind of attention. Every time she smiled in public, every time she spoke with her usual warmth to guests or staff, he thought of the envelope, the handwriting, the ring. He wondered if she knew the letter had resurfaced. He wondered if she had left it for him intentionally, a warning, a confession, or perhaps a challenge. At a private dinner with a small group of friends, he noticed her wearing a necklace he had not seen in years. It wasn't new, but it was not part of her usual selection for such occasions. The sight of it made him think of the ring, of the possibility that there were other pieces, other tokens, each carrying its own unspoken history. He felt a flicker of something between suspicion and resignation. If she had kept one thing, why not more? Late one night, when the palace was quiet, Charles unlocked the desk drawer and looked at the letter again. The words were so simple, so understated, yet they had the power to tilt the ground beneath him. For that day, you know what? He could not help but imagine scenarios, a clandestine meeting, a private exchange, a moment that had belonged entirely to someone else. The aide returned a week later with preliminary results. The handwriting was distinctive enough to narrow the possibilities. It matched samples from a man once connected to Camilla's wider circle. Not a household name, but a figure with enough influence to move in and out of royal-adjacent society without attracting much attention. He was older now, living mostly out of the public eye, but his past placed him in the same circles and the same cities as Camilla during the period of the engraved date. The name meant nothing to the public, But to Charles, it meant the story was coming into focus. The ring had been made for her. The letter had been written to her. And both had been kept, not discarded, not forgotten. He dismissed the aid for the night, but sleep never came. Instead, he sat in the dim light of his study, the letter and the ring before him, the two objects side by side. Together, they formed a truth he could almost see but not yet name aloud. And in the silence, he understood that the moment of decision was approaching. Once he had the final piece, there would be no more space for doubt and no more time to hide from the answer. The decision to meet the man did not come easily. For weeks, Charles had weighed the risks in his mind, aware that any movement outside the palace that could be linked to him was an invitation for speculation. Yet the combination of the ring, the engraved date, and the letter had created a pressure that could no longer be contained by patient investigation alone. He needed to look into the eyes of the one person who might know the truth. The arrangements were made quietly, with the aide handling every detail through indirect channels. No official cars, no palace security in visible formation. The meeting would take place in a private room of an exclusive members-only club in the countryside, a place where anonymity was part of the air one breathed. The man in question had agreed to meet under the pretense of discussing a charitable project, plausible enough to shield both from suspicion, but vague enough to leave room for what Charles truly intended. On the day of the meeting, the weather was cold and damp, the kind of gray that seemed to wrap itself around the landscape. Charles traveled in a discreet, unmarked vehicle, dressed not in the polished formality of public life, but in a muted suit that allowed him to blend in. His driver, one of the few briefed on the nature of the journey, kept silent the entire way, eyes fixed on the road ahead. When Charles entered the private room, the man was already there, seated at a polished oak table with a glass of water in front of him. He stood to greet the king, offering a polite handshake and a faint smile that carried neither warmth nor hostility, only curiosity. He was in his late 60s now, his hair silvered, his posture still upright. There was an air about him that spoke of someone accustomed to moving in influential circles without leaving much trace behind. They began with the formalities, speaking briefly about mutual acquaintances, about charitable endeavors, about the weather. Charles kept his tone even, his eyes steady. But as the conversation wound through these safe topics, he could sense the undercurrent. Both men knew there was another reason for this meeting. Finally, Charles set down his glass and leaned slightly forward. He did not produce the ring or the letter. They were too valuable, too dangerous to reveal outright. But he described them in precise detail. He mentioned the date engraved inside the band, the craftsmanship, the two sapphires flanking the diamond. He described the brief note written on fine stationery, and signed but unmistakable to those who knew the hand. The man's reaction was subtle, but it was there. A pause, just long enough to register. A shift in the eyes, the smallest tightening of the jaw. When he spoke, his voice was measured, as though weighing each word. "That was a long time ago," he said. Charles felt the words settle between them like a stone dropped into still water. He asked nothing outright, but his gaze held, pressing silently for more. The man took a slow breath and went on, speaking of a period in his life when he had been close to someone who meant more to him than he had expected. He did not name Camilla, but the absence of her name made the implication louder. He spoke of a gift meant to mark a day significant only to them, a day that had been theirs alone. There was no confession, no explicit admission. Yet in the careful way he avoided certain words, in the guarded way he acknowledged the existence of the gift, Charles heard what he had feared. The ring was no accident, no forgotten trinket. It had been a deliberate offering, wrapped in sentiment and memory, meant to last beyond the moment. Charles asked one final question, his voice low. "Do you know if she still has it?" The man hesitated, his eyes meeting Charles's with a look that carried both knowledge and restraint. "If she does," he said quietly, "then it's because it still matters to her." That was all. The meeting ended with polite farewells, the kind exchanged by men who might never speak again, but who had shared something unspoken. Charles walked out into the gray afternoon, the damp air cooling the heat that had risen in his chest. The drive back to the palace was silent, the countryside rolling past in muted colors. By the time he returned to his study, the weight of the conversation had settled fully. He placed his hands on the desk, leaning into the polished wood as though it might hold him steady. There was no longer any real doubt about the ring's origin or its meaning. What remained was the question of what to do with the truth, whether to confront her, to demand an explanation, or to carry the knowledge in silence, knowing it would color every glance, every word, every moment between them from now on.